Welcome to this explainer. We're diving straight into how the Second World War wasn't just about troop movements and map lines, but was fundamentally 6 years of hell on Earth for hundreds of millions of people. You know, it's so easy to get caught up in the tactical genius of generals, or the specs of tanks and planes. But as we go through this today, I want to keep our focus entirely on the human story. From the soldiers shivering in the mud to the everyday civilians caught right in the crossfire, this is the story of humanity facing its darkest hour.
To make sense of it all, we're breaking this explainer down into 4 parts: the flames of war ignite, the Axis ascendant, a war against civilians, and finally, the tide begins to turn.
Starting off with Part 1, the flames of war ignite. This global catastrophe didn't just happen overnight. It was actually a slow, deliberate burn. Watch the animation here. You can trace exactly how peace just completely unraveled step by step. From Japan's local actions with the Marco Polo Bridge incident in '37, right through Europe's failed appeasement at Munich in '38, and then bam, Hitler's brazen invasion of Poland in '39. It was a domino effect of unchecked aggression that just pulled the entire globe into chaos.
But let's ground this in human reality for a second. Listen to this diary entry from a Chinese officer. Intense Japanese artillery fire as if it would level the mountains and wipe out the sea. Think about that. Long before London or Warsaw were bombed, the people in Chinese cities were already experiencing the absolute unyielding terror of modern industrialized warfare.
Moving on to Part 2, the Axis ascendant. What's truly shocking here is just how incredibly fast the Axis powers moved.
We have to talk about Blitzkrieg, lightning war. This was a calculated fantasy that worked flawlessly. But it wasn't just about moving tanks and planes quickly. It was a devastating psychological weapon. The whole goal was to bypass static defenses, completely surround the enemy, and literally shatter their will to fight before they even realized what hit them.
Which brings us to a massive number, 338,000. That is the staggering amount of Allied troops evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. When the German armor broke through France, hundreds of thousands of men were completely trapped. And it was everyday people in civilian boats who pulled off a miraculous rescue. It saved the army, sure, but the cost was immense. They left their heavy weapons behind, and Britain was suddenly left entirely alone.
And stand alone they did. Churchill hit the nail on the head when he said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He was talking about the exhausted, vastly outgunned fighter pilots of the Royal Air Force. They flew multiple missions a day during the Battle of Britain, breaking the Luftwaffe's momentum and proving to the world that civilian morale wouldn't just crack.
Meanwhile, over in the Pacific, things were looking incredibly grim. British imperial defenses were completely outmaneuvered. While the British expected a conventional fight and tied their defenses to the main roads, highly trained Japanese soldiers just slipped right past them through the dense jungle. They even seized British food and weapons, arrogantly calling them Churchill's supplies, using them to fuel their advance until the impregnable fortress of Singapore suffered a heartbreaking surrender in February 1942.
This brings us to Part 3, a war against civilians. And fair warning, this is the darkest aspect of our explainer, because this conflict fundamentally erased the boundaries between the battlefield and the home front.
Standard wars are usually about grabbing land or resources, right? But this was a terrifying new kind of ideological warfare. Hitler's War of Annihilation in the East and Japan's racist imperial policies were explicitly designed to exterminate entire civilian populations. The very existence of these people was treated as a threat that needed to be brutally eliminated to secure absolute dominance.
Just take a look at this number, 30 million. That is the staggering amount of Slavic people the German High Command coldly calculated they would need to starve to death just to feed their invading army during Operation Barbarossa. They actually called it the Hunger Plan. It's just chilling to see logistics and deep-seated ideological hatred merge into a mathematical policy of mass murder.
But we can never forget the intimate tragedy behind those statistics. Listen to Abraham Lewin from the Warsaw Ghetto. Mothers lose their children. A week-old woman is carried. Children walking in the street are seized. Universal blackness. The despair was absolute. Long before the gas chambers were fully operational, the Holocaust had already begun with systemic isolation, dehumanization, and brutal starvation.
And identical ideological horrors were playing out in Asia, driven by the toxic racism of the Japanese military regime. It was a pattern of totally unrestrained violence. From the unimaginable civilian massacre in Nanjing to the targeted mass killings in Singapore and forcing starving prisoners on the Bataan Death March under a scorching sun,
The systemic disregard for human life was just absolute. Okay, moving into part 4, the tide begins to turn. Because eventually, massive strategic miscalculations woke up new adversaries, and against all odds, the momentum finally started to shift.
December 7th, 1941. FDR called it a date which will live in infamy. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor was a tremendous tactical success for Japan, but it was a catastrophic political disaster. They crippled battleships, sure, but they missed the aircraft carriers and the oil reserves. More importantly, they instantly united the American people, transforming a reluctant observer into a fiercely determined combatant for total war.
And once American industrial might was unleashed, it was a real game changer. As the animation highlights here, U.S. aircraft production absolutely skyrocketed, from just over 2,000 planes in 1940 to nearly 100,000 by 1944. It proves that modern warfare is heavily dictated by manufacturing. The Axis powers had great early tactics, but they simply couldn't compete with an enemy that was launching a brand new ship every single day. So by late 1942, the relentless Axis momentum finally hit a brick wall across 3 entirely different theaters of war. The German advance freezes outside Moscow, Japanese naval supremacy is shattered in minutes at Midway, and Rommel's forces are decisively beaten at El Alamein. The Allies permanently shifted from playing defense to going on the offensive. To put the Eastern Front into perspective, imagine minus 40 degrees Celsius. Hitler's rapid summer invasion plan completely failed to account for the brutal Russian winter. We're talking temperatures so insanely cold that soup literally froze in soldiers' bowls. Engines died, weapons jammed, thousands got frostbite, and the better adapted Soviet forces seized the moment to counterattack.
Meanwhile, in the Pacific, U.S. codebreakers pulled off a masterclass, laying a trap at Midway that completely shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. Losing 4 elite carriers and hundreds of veteran pilots was a blow they couldn't recover from. In fact, one Japanese admiral admitted, "Our forces suffered a reverse so decisive the details of it were kept a secret." They actually hid their own wounded sailors from the public out of sheer shame.
The Allies basically executed a massive 4-step comeback: halt the expansion, ramp up production, secure the Atlantic, and launch counterattacks. That third step was absolutely crucial. If they hadn't defeated the U-boats and secured those vital supply lines, all that incredible American production we talked about would have just ended up at the bottom of the ocean instead of fueling the fight.
So the whole direction of the war had been reversed. From the freezing mud of Moscow to the steaming green hell of Guadalcanal, these mighty empires forged by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were now forcefully being rolled back. Their aura of invincibility was gone. They were no longer dictating the terms, they were just reacting to the overwhelming might of the Allies. Churchill summed up this massive global pivot perfectly. Now, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is, perhaps, the end of the beginning. It's a really sobering thought. By the end of 1942, the survival of the free world was secured. Yeah, but everyone knew that the brutal, grinding road to total victory was really just starting. Which leaves us with a massive question to ponder. With the tide finally turning, how would the millions of ordinary people caught in the crossfire endure the unimaginable destruction still required to achieve total victory? If the first few years were hell on earth, ending the war would demand resilience on a scale humanity had never seen before. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. We've got a whole lot more of this history to uncover.